The Russian Federation's army has failed in its plans to capture Pokrovsk. A strike on the Ryazan oil refinery and the losses of the occupying army. This is War Map on Air at Freedom. I'm Oleg Borisov. Hello. Let's begin our overview of the situation in the Pokrovsk direction. Ukraine's defense forces are holding the northern part of Pokrovsk and are preventing Russian troops from advancing into the central part of the city. According to the Vostok military group, the invaders are suffering heavy losses. Ukrainian soldiers also reported, that searches for Russian groups continue in Pokrovsk and fierce fighting is ongoing within the urban area. In Mirnograd, Ukrainian defenders are holding the line and eliminating Russian occupiers on the approaches to the city. Ukrainian fighters are also organizing new supply routes for two settlements to provide units with everything they need and, if necessary, to quickly carry out evacuations. Currently, fighting continues in the areas of the settlements of Ryshine, Krasny Lyman, Rodinske, Mirnograd, and Kotlin. Let's move on and discuss the situation in the Kupiansk direction. Here, the Russians overestimated their strength and are suffering losses. The occupiers once again claim to have supposedly encircled Kupiansk and advanced on several sections of the front around the city. But this does not correspond to reality. The Ukrainian General Staff refutes this. Viktor Trehubov, head of communications for the Joint Forces Group, stated that the Russians tried to make reality fit their own statements, but only made things worse. In the northern districts of the city, the Russians are not present, and there they are being destroyed by Ukrainian drones and counteractions, the spokesperson noted. Currently, fighting is being recorded in the areas of the settlements of Petropavlivka, Pishchane, and Kolesnikivka. The defense forces are successfully repelling attacks by the Russian occupiers. Let's move on and talk about the situation in the Vovchansk direction. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, the Russians have made some advances here, but they are unable to gain a foothold, as the city is practically destroyed. Ukrainian drone operators are actively working here, successfully eliminating the enemy. It should be noted that there are more Russians in terms of numbers in this direction. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine also added that the occupiers continue their tactic of human wave assaults, disregarding heavy losses among their personnel. Currently, fighting is being recorded in the areas of Sinelnikove, Izbitske, and Kolodezne. Next, let's talk in more detail about deep strikes. For the third time this month and the ninth time since the beginning of the year, Ukrainian drones have attacked the Rosneft oil refinery in Ryazan. Importantly, the refinery is located more than 500 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. The plant's design capacity is 17 million tons of oil per year. It is one of the largest in Russia. According to monitoring resources, the drone strike damaged its key installation. And we will discuss this in more detail with Dmitry Snegirev, a military and political analyst. Dmitry, hello. What losses does Russia suffer as a result of such attacks on oil refineries?
According to the Russian side itself, the total losses to the Russian economy as a result of Ukrainian drone attacks on oil refining facilities are already approaching around $100 billion. This is a very serious blow, even for a country that's essentially a gas station. But most importantly, these are political, reputational, and economic losses for the occupying country. Let me explain what I mean. The gas station country is being forced at the government level to make unprecedented decisions to temporarily ban the export of fuel and lubricants from gasoline to diesel fuel, and at the same time is compelled to import gasoline and diesel from the territory of the Republic of Belarus and Kazakhstan. In other words, the Russian Federation is essentially admitting the undeniable fact that despite its truly enormous and abundant natural resources, namely its vast oil and gas reserves, it is actually and regrettably forced to offset the significant financial losses stemming from Ukrainian strikes, specifically through crucial imports, a clear indication of its current economic vulnerabilities. And given that the Russian economy is experiencing quite serious problems, this puts enormous pressure, accordingly, on the Russian budget. Let me remind you, dear viewers, according to Russian economists, the expenditure side of the Russian budget will already increase by 4% in 2026. These are enormous economic losses. And moreover, note that the strikes practically every moment, every month, are actually surpassing the previous month in both the number of affected refineries and, accordingly, the number of Ukrainian strike assets used. And these are far from just Ukrainian drones anymore. Ukrainian ballistic missiles have now come into play. And starting next year, Ukrainian developers are talking about the possibility of striking Russian territory with Ukrainian ballistic missiles with a range of up to 800 kilometers. And that means, accordingly, new refineries will be burning brightly.
I want to emphasize that this is far from the first time Ukrainian drones have covered such distances, successfully attacking targets in the Russian Federation. So where is the Russian air defense?
There is practically no Russian air defense. And it's worth noting that to cover key sites in Moscow and the Moscow region, air defense systems are even being transferred from the Arctic region, remarkably without even changing their camouflage. This is very telling, and it should be noted that the Russian side is forced to admit that their air defense system is so-called localized or spotty in nature. It's also quite remarkable that the occupying country is now adopting Ukraine's successful tactics, specifically the use of mobile fire groups. In the Russian Federation, these are called Stalin's Falcons. But just how much of a falcon they really are can be judged at least by the number of oil refineries that have either partially or completely ceased operations as a result of Ukrainian drone strikes. More than 40%. So as we can see, the Falcon's wings are not in reliable working condition. And if we sum up the situation with air defense, it's worth noting another very remarkable fact. The redeployment of S-400 and S-300 surface-to-air missile systems from the Leningrad region, that is, from covering the NATO borders directly to the combat zone and the Moscow region. That's the priority. This is evidence that there aren't enough air defense systems. It should also be noted that the drones of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine have been employing a successful tactic in targeting and destroying Russian air defense systems, both in the temporarily occupied territories of the Zaporizhia region. For example, just yesterday another Buk air defense system was hit, and accordingly in the territory of occupied Crimea. There, this is already becoming a good tradition, as the drones of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine have destroyed 8 legitimate military targets over the past 2 weeks. We are talking about the radars of S-400 surface-to-air missile systems and the S-400 launchers themselves.
On the other hand, according to information from the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Russia is losing more than 1,000 of its soldiers on the front every day. Is there anyone to make up for these colossal losses?
At the moment, the actual replenishment of these colossal losses, and the losses are truly colossal, is being carried out using 3 main resources. The first is the so-called contract soldiers. But here's a rather remarkable point. According to the perpetually drunk former president of the Russian Federation, Medvedev, from January to November, 336,000 citizens of the Russian Federation signed contracts with the Russian army. But here's a very telling detail. According to British intelligence, Russian losses amount to 353,000. This exceeds the ability to replenish personnel through these so-called contract soldiers. And most importantly, there's no money to pay the contract soldiers. For example, Sakha-Yakutia, one of the richest regions of the Russian Federation, oil, gas, diamonds, has refused to continue social support programs for so-called special military operation veterans and to make one-time payments under the contracts. The second source for replenishing personnel is the total mobilization taking place in the occupied territories of Ukraine, primarily in the Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions. And the third is the so-called Special Contingent K. That is, these are inmates from Russian prisons who, according to a decree by the Russian dictator, currently have the right to sign a contract with the Ministry of Defense even in the courtroom. Already about 80,000 Russian prisoners have thus been added to the ranks of the occupying army, but in reality, almost all of them have already been disposed of. It is enough to recall the grim experience of the Wagner PMC, which essentially tested this tactic of using prisoners as cannon fodder. And a very telling fact is this: Russian public channels are reporting colossal losses among the Russian occupiers on a specific section of the front. We're talking about Vovchansk, which is allegedly taken by the Russian occupiers. So, according to the Russian servicemen themselves, in military unit 54034, the 83rd Motorized Rifle Regiment, more than 70% of the personnel have already been effectively wiped out as a result of these so-called meat assaults. This is the true indicator of the losses suffered by the Russian occupiers. And another very telling point is the losses of the Russian occupiers near Pokrovsk. More than 500 Russian assault troops are eliminated every day by Ukrainian special units of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine and the Special Operations Forces.
The publication The Economist released an article stating that 1% of the male population of the Russian Federation has already been eliminated by Ukraine's defense forces as a result of this Russian war against Ukraine. But you also mentioned specially trained assault troops who are also being destroyed, eliminated by the defense forces. How much time does it take, and does Russia as a whole even have that time to train this kind of assault troops?
Absolutely not. Let's take another look at Russian social media channels. They report that people who have signed a contract are already directly involved in frontline combat within 2 weeks. 12 days is the duration of training for a so-called assault trooper. In other words, it's simply impossible to properly train someone in such a short period. And this is evidence that the Russian Federation is essentially using World War II tactics, specifically what's known as Zhukov-style tactics. Women will give birth to more. But as we can see, even the ability of Russian women to produce more cannon fodder is now quite limited. Over 1 million personnel losses. Moreover, the problems with staffing are already raising concerns among the political leadership of the Russian Federation, which indicates, accordingly, first, serious issues with replenishing personnel, and second, the unwillingness of most Russians to die on Ukrainian territory for the very vague ideas of the so-called Russian world.
Dmitry, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on air. Dmitry Snegirev, military and political analyst, was with us live in this studio. Well, we will of course continue to keep you informed about everything happening both in Ukraine and around the world. Naturally, we are analyzing and monitoring the situation at the front. For more information, check out our Freedom Telegram channel and Freedom YouTube channel. Thank you for your trust, and see you next time.